Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's November 27th, and we have a lot to talk about. We're into the final few days of National Family Caregivers Month, and my guest on the podcast is Scott Williams, Vice President, Head of Global Patient Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at EMD Seronos. Now, EMD Seronos is a pharmaceutical company that's made it part of their mission to acknowledge the role of MS caregivers, raise awareness of the role of MS caregivers, and to give voice to advocating on behalf of their often unmet needs. But before we get to my conversation with Scott Williams, there are a few other things that you should know about. I'd like you to try something with me. It'll take just a moment, and all you need is your imagination. I want you to imagine that we live in a world where no one ever learned how to swim. But we were all told not to worry about that, because there were lifeguards stationed at all the places where we might drown. Now, on the one hand, you might think that having those lifeguards in all the right places is a pretty good thing. After all, that's exactly what you'd hope for if you ever found yourself drowning. But on the other hand, how would you feel knowing that you'd have to be drowning, you'd have to be in a life or death situation before you received any help? You might prefer living in a world where once you knew you'd be spending a lot of time in and around the water, you could be proactive and learn how to swim before you were in a position where you were fighting for your life. Well, the good news is that we can all learn to swim whenever we choose. But the bad news is that for so many caregivers, the resources that are available to support them and help keep them afloat physically, emotionally, financially, in every way, those resources are too often made available only after they find themselves struggling and feeling overwhelmed by taking on a high-stress role for which they were probably never prepared. When someone's initially diagnosed with MS, a good neurologist is probably going to explain the long-term benefit of immediately beginning disease-modifying therapy. They might talk about the benefits of making smart lifestyle choices like quitting smoking, eating a healthy diet, and exercising regularly, because research suggests that all of these things can delay disease progression and have a positive impact on the overall health and well-being of people living with MS. So a good neurologist is going to encourage someone newly diagnosed with MS to be proactive when it comes to their own self-care. But who's having that same sort of conversation with family members who may become caregivers for that person who's been newly diagnosed? Now, I'm sure that conversation happens some of the time, but I'm positive that it doesn't happen often enough. So I'm suggesting that we start talking about a Caregiver Protocol, a set of recommended steps that can be introduced in the neurologist's office that are designed to proactively help caregivers get a jump on their own self-care. This not only benefits the caregiver themselves, but a caregiver who maintains their sense of overall balance is going to be a better caregiver, and that directly benefits that family member who they're caring for. Now, will every caregiver step up and take advantage of the Caregiver Protocol? Of course not. No more than every person who's been newly diagnosed with MS is going to start exercising or choose a healthier diet. But the ones that do tend to benefit, and the same will hold true for their caregivers. Defining a best practice is about providing a path for those who, once they understand the benefit, may be inclined to explore it. I'd like to see the path for caregiver well-being begin before caregivers find themselves treading water. And I'd love to know what you think about this. So do me a favor, shoot me an email at john@realtalkms.com. That's JON@realtalkms.com, and share your thoughts with me. Last week, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a warning saying that MS symptoms may severely worsen after stopping the disease-modifying therapy Gilenya. Quoting from the FDA's official notice, it reads, quote, "The Food and Drug Administration is warning that when the multiple sclerosis medicine Gilenya is stopped, the disease can become much worse than before the medicine was started or while it was being taken. This MS worsening is rare, but can result in permanent disability. As a result, we've added a new warning about this risk to the prescribing information of the Gilenya drug label and patient medication guide." Now, the FDA warning mentions that this disease worsening is rare. Their formal announcement points out that in the 8 years since Gilenya received FDA approval, there have been 35 cases of what they classify as, quote, "severely increased disability accompanied by the presence of multiple new lesions that occurred 2 to 24 weeks after Gilenya was stopped," end quote. The FDA communicated safety information related to Gilenya in 2015 when they warned about the possibility of rare brain infection, and in 2012 when they revised their cardiovascular monitoring recommendations for people who were being treated with Gilenya. You can find a link to the FDA's complete warning in today's show notes. A company called Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics has submitted an investigational new drug application to the FDA to begin a Phase 2 clinical trial designed to evaluate the safety and activity of its cell therapy called Neurone in people living with progressive MS. The company is already enrolling patients in a separate Phase 3 clinical trial that will study the same cell therapy in treating ALS. Neurone is a stem cell therapy that takes the patient's own mesenchymal stem cells, modifies them, and returns them to the patient to promote nerve cell supporting mechanisms. These modified stem cells are engineered to produce signaling molecules that regulate the activity of surrounding cells, as well as secrete neurotropic factors that support the growth and survival of nerve cells. Now, the company's expectations are that these modified mesenchymal stem cells could regulate neurodegeneration while protecting neurons from damage. The existence of some sort of relationship between the Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis is a topic of ongoing conversation and scientific research, and Atara Therapeutics has published some promising results of a Phase 1 clinical trial of their investigational ATA190 cell therapy that will likely add to that ongoing conversation and spur additional research. The ATA190 cell therapy wipes out immune B cells infected with the Epstein-Barr virus, and in this small Phase 1 clinical trial, this led to neurological improvements and reduced symptoms in trial participants with primary and secondary progressive MS. Now, ATA190 is made from a patient's own immune T cells. The cells are collected and modified in a lab to target Epstein-Barr infected cells. Then these modified immune cells are infused back into the patient's blood. And the goal is for these modified immune T cells to recognize Epstein-Barr infected B cells and kill them. Well, this small study enrolled 5 people living with primary progressive MS and 5 people living with secondary progressive MS. These 10 study participants had been living with progressive neurological deterioration due to MS for an average of just over 10 years. The study participants received 4 escalating doses of ATA190 over an 8-week period, and then they were followed for 27 weeks after their first infusion. The study participants didn't experience serious adverse side effects, although one of them experienced some distortion in their sense of taste. And the results of the study indicated that 7 out of the 10 participants experienced neurological improvements, including increased productivity and improved cognition, accompanied by a reduction in their MS symptoms. Fatigue was also slightly reduced, but this result didn't appear to be statistically significant. Now, Atara Therapeutics is also developing another therapy to eliminate Epstein-Barr infected cells in the central nervous system. It's called ATA188, and ATA-188 uses immune cells from donors and not from the patients themselves. The company is planning on extending its clinical trial research on both of these therapies. And if you'd like to learn more about the ATA-190 Phase 1 clinical trial, I'll include a link to the trial results in today's show notes. If you're a regular listener, you might remember that last February, one of my guests on the podcast was Kay Julian, the Executive Vice President who oversees services at the National MS Society. And we took a deep dive into the Ms Navigator Program, which I think is simply remarkable. Well, I had an opportunity to connect with Kay a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the Ms Navigator Program, and Kay shared some amazing numbers that I want to share with you. In 2018, so we're talking about this year alone, the MS Navigators supported more than 50,000 individuals by phone, online chat, email, social media, and even fax. And keep in mind, we're talking about individual one-on-one support. An MS Navigator spends an average of 3.5 hours with each person that they engage with. The top 5 areas of support are benefits, insurance, and employment, social and emotional support, housing, neurological referrals, and home care. Demographically, the average person who turns to MS Navigators for support has a median age of 53. 74% are female, and 72% have been living with MS for an average of 15 years. I found the demographic profile interesting in that it didn't point to someone who was newly diagnosed, but instead, it was someone who had been living with MS for several years. And if you're interested in the kind of report card that MS Navigator Program receives from the people that they engage with, well, 94% indicate that they would recommend the MS Navigator Program, and 87% feel as though they're able to utilize new resources to find solutions for themselves. So if you missed the podcast episode last February, when Kay, Julian, and I first talked about it, let me introduce you to one of the most remarkable individual support programs that I've ever come across. It's called the MS Navigator Program, and it's specifically designed to help people affected by MS find lasting solutions for the unique and often complex challenges that MS can bring. Just check today's show notes, and I'll include a link to the MS Navigator section of the National MS Society's website, and a link to the RealTalk MS episode, where Kay Julian and I discuss this amazing program in detail. November is National Family Caregivers Month, and I couldn't think of a better way to end the month than talking with my guest, Scott Williams, Vice President, Head of Global Patient Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at EMD Seronos. EMD Seronos has truly set itself apart as a company with a commitment to shining a bright light on the role that MS caregivers play and advocating for and even partnering in the development of resources designed to ease caregiver burden. In a moment, my guest Scott Williams will join me to discuss EMD Seronos' commitment to caregivers. My guest today is Scott Williams. Scott is Vice President, Head of Global Patient Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at EMD Seronos. And EMD Seronos has really distinguished itself by using its resources and its reach to shine a bright light on the role of MS caregivers and on the sometimes overlooked needs of MS caregivers. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
John, thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm glad you could make the time. And before we get into our conversation, full disclosure, it's been my honor to talk about my own journey as an MS caregiver in Seeing MS from the Inside Out, the documentary film that EMD Seronos debuted last month at ECTRIMS, which is the largest MS research conference in the world. And I'm also a participant in your Embracing Carers initiative, which we'll get into in a minute. But I guess we could start at the beginning, Scott. What motivates a large pharmaceutical company to focus on the needs of MS caregivers?
Well, thank you, John, for that question. I think it's really at the core of who we are as a company. You know, when you think about our commitment to patients and our commitment to society, it's really all about how can we really make a difference for people. And as a part of this effort, we began about 2.5 years ago, really taking a hard look at what we were doing to make a difference in the lives of people. And we went out all around the globe to really talk about what were some of those unmet needs, and really who was being overlooked in our healthcare systems around the world, as well as here in the U.S. And I have to tell you, John, everyone we spoke to is actually probably over 100 stakeholders continued to come back and say to us that no one was uniquely looking at the needs of caregivers and carers. And what was so shocking about the feedback was folks understood the fact that traditionally and to date, the conversation has been, how can the caregiver take better care of the patient, of course, or their loved one? But it was also taking a moment to reflect and say, how can we better take care of those that are providing this critical care and support to their loved ones and to those patients? How can we make sure that those, as you mentioned, often overlooked needs for them are met? And I have to tell you, with the great commitment of our senior leaders, and really the company is EMD Seronos being, a little bit different in that we're a family-owned company, and we're now a part of the 13th generation of the family. It's kind of the family DNA and spirit is very much within who we are. And it was about 2 years ago that we really embarked and began this journey with, as you mentioned, the official launch of Embracing Cares about a year ago now at the International Cares Conference in Australia. And at that time, we really began to look at what really are real people that really need this support. And really, as you mentioned, in MS, we heard time and time again that it was really time to shine a light on the needs of MS caregivers.
Well, I know since its launch last year, Embracing Carers has developed a presence in the U.S., the U.K., Australia, Canada, France, Germany, India, Italy, and Spain. And just a few days ago, you announced that Embracing Carers was expanding to Brazil, and I understand there are even conversations going on in China. So this is really a global initiative designed to address situations that caregivers face all over the world. Tell us about some of the goals that Embracing Carers is hoping to achieve specifically.
When you look at the global movement that is Embracing Carers, it's really working hand in hand with caregiver organizations and partners from all around the world. Here in the U.S., we've had the chance to work with the National Alliance for Caregiving, the Caregiver Action Network, globally with the International Alliance of Care Organizations. So it's really a movement together with the community to make a difference. And as we've come together as, stakeholders interested in making a difference in the lives of carers, we've really rallied around 4 key mission pillars. The first being very much raising awareness and really helping those that maybe haven't really thought about the needs of carers to hear that and to really understand that there is support out there and tools and resources that make a real meaningful difference in their lives. The second one was really around broader stakeholder engagement, recognizing that, none of us can really take on this global public health issue ourselves, that we really needed other voices like, employers or, public health entities or governments to really join in this movement with us. Then the third being healthcare system engagement and integration, really looking at how is the carer voice really being incorporated into discussions within healthcare systems and within individual provider visits, et cetera. And then lastly, looking also at policy. Many of the caregiver organizations have had success worldwide in advocating for greater support and policies to really advance and better support the needs of carers. And what more could we as a really global advocacy movement do with Embracing Carers to really help elevate those needs and to really drive a policy conversation. So that those 4 areas, John, have really formed the core of what Embracing Carers is all about.
Well, I know that before debuting the MS from the Inside Out documentary last month at ECTRIMS, you also issued a report detailing the results of the International Carers Survey. Can you tell us a little bit about that survey and maybe share some of the specifics from the survey that stood out for you?
Yeah, I'd be so happy to. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so this survey was a global survey looking at 3,500 carers from around the world and really understanding what those needs, gaps, as well as really maybe some of the facts that we really haven't explored traditionally, and it all came together into the publication of the Global State of Care report that you mentioned. And to me, I'm a former cared for patient myself, as well as I'm currently actually a carer for my mom, and I've been in that role now for over 15 years as she suffered from multiple chronic conditions. So it's been interesting for me to kind of see the issue of caregiving from both sides. My dad being my carer, and then now caring for my mom. And I have to tell you, I struggled with the issue of self-identification and actually viewing myself as a carer. I for the longest time thought I was, just a son who loved his mom, and never really considered that the role that I was playing was an important one, and that I actually needed support and tools and resources, not only to empower and take care of myself, but to also be a better carer for my mom. And so some of the things that jumped out to me in the survey were the fact that over half of the time, the carers were feeling depressed or anxiety or just frankly overwhelmed by the assistance and support that they're providing to their loved ones. That really, jumped out and hit home to me, and frankly probably made me realize some of the issues that I haven't really appropriately thought through over my caregiving journey. And then also, too, the other one that really jumped out to me was over half of carers weren't taking the time to either book or attend their own medical appointments, and that they're very much sacrificing their own health and well-being to take care of their loved ones. And, upon reflection, to me, seeing that data from a pretty significant sample size of carers from around the world, just made me realize that, if you don't take the time to care for yourself, you really can't care for your loved ones. So, I think when I look at it holistically, John, those are really the two that jumped out and struck me from the survey effort.
I was touched by the same two issues that you highlighted, and then one that also concerned me, and I think was you could consider almost a subset of the self-care issue as a whole, is almost half the carers indicated that they felt that they were under emotional stress. And emotional stress can take you down a very isolating and scary path. And when you end up at the end of that path, now you're dealing with issues like caregiver burnout. And then we have two people to take care of, the person who's dealing with that chronic illness at home. And now we also need to try to fix that caregiver. So, failing to take advantage of self-care and failing to take advantage of resources that are available before things become a crisis seemed really important to me.
Oh, I'm so glad that you called that out. And it really was another one of the findings that, was a real eye-opener for us as well. And I have to tell you, we've really been thinking together with our caregiver organization partners of, what, as you mentioned, kind of what additional tools or resources may be needed to really, enhance the spotlight on some of those self-care and emotional stress needs and opportunities. And frankly, we're actively looking for ways to collaborate with the community even further to take those on. So I'm so glad that you mentioned it.
Well, that kind of brings me to the next logical question, which would be, what's next? Now that I think EMD Seronos has done just a stellar job of raising the issue of caring for the caregivers and raising the awareness around some of the potential pitfalls and some of the things that we want to be so cognizant of, what sort of action needs to follow?
Yeah, a great question. I think really, to me, the action that comes next is, really working with specifically, and if you don't mind, I'll talk about the MS community, if that's okay.
That would work.
From our perspective, really, working with the MS community in a variety of ways to really, create awareness and provide that support for MS carers. And, I think that this includes the documentary and the partnership with you, as well as, supporting the National MS Society, Can Do MS and, MSAA programs that support MS carers, as well as, frankly, looking at the important role that carers also play in healthcare solution and drug development as well. And I have to tell you, this is an area that we've been speaking a lot with our colleagues in research and development about, on how we can really better integrate the carer perspective into our development efforts earlier and earlier. And we went through an effort with a lot of our cross-functional colleagues to say, what are those intersection points where we can better engage, frankly, folks like yourself, John, to really incorporate your feedback and input earlier. So we're really excited about some of the efforts in that space. And then when we look at it a little bit more holistically, we're thinking about how, movements like the patient-focused drug development efforts at FDA can also be more mindful of the carer voice and perspective. And we've been really happy to collaborate with the National Alliance for Caregiving to specifically look at this issue. And I know they just recently convened a multi-stakeholder meeting earlier this month in Washington, D.C., and are in the middle of publishing a report of findings on how we can better do that. So that's a little bit more of a holistic example, but I think for us, we want to partner more, and we really are looking at the entire MS community as well as our pipeline to really figure out how we can really advance that commitment to continuing our support, and that we very much want the community's perspective into everything that we're doing, especially around how we can better amplify the carer voice. So to me, it's really about advancing the key collaborations, doing more together with the community, and then specifically really taking a hard look at ourselves and finding every opportunity we can to incorporate the carer voice.
Well, this excites me, and it really excites me because obviously from my perspective, I spend a lot of time talking about caregivers and specifically MS caregivers and some of their unmet needs and some of the areas where they can use support and look for resources. And no matter which sort of stakeholder I happen to be talking to, nobody ever tells me, well, gee, that's a bad idea. So I think everybody's heart and mind is in the right place. And I really see you guys as a catalyzing force who can kind of mobilize all of that good intention and turn it into something that can actually make a difference in people's lives. And, from my personal perspective, that thrills me. So thanks for that.
Oh, well, thank you. And honestly, I truly believe that by, working together and really taking a community, and collaboration-driven approach, we can really make some progress.
Well, if carers who are listening haven't yet connected with the Embracing Carers initiative, where can they go online to connect with you guys?
Great. Yeah, if they're looking for more information, they can visit embracingcarers.com, and they'll really find a wealth of resources from the survey that we talked about to the Global State of Care report, as well as links to each of the different organizations working here within the U.S. as well as around the rest of the world. So some really, really great resources that'll not only be a hub, but also connect them with other support as well.
Great. And if listeners want to check out the Seeing MS from the Inside Out documentary, I'll include a link in today's show notes. And if you've already downloaded the RealTalk MS app, you'll get the complete International MS Carers report, which includes a survey that we've been discussing as bonus content with this RealTalk MS episode. Scott, I know I speak for myself, and I'm sure I can articulate what may be in the hearts and minds of so many other MS caregivers when I say thank you for the global platform that EMD Seronos has created for MS caregivers and for the work that you continue to do in advocating on our behalf. And thanks for talking with me today.
Well, John, honestly, it was an absolute pleasure, and so grateful for all of your advocacy and fantastic work, and we really look forward to continuing the journey with you.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't yet, I hope you visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or device. It's the easiest way for you to stay connected to the podcast. You'll never miss an episode, and the app allows me to share all sorts of bonus content with you. This week, you'll get a copy of the complete International MS Carers report that Scott Williams and I were just discussing, but you'll only find it in the Real Talk MS app. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.